Our scripture reading this morning is from Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jerusalem and was passing through town. A man there named Zacchaeus, a ruler among tax collectors, was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he couldn't because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed up a sycamore tree so he could see Jesus, who was about to pass that way. When Jesus came to that spot, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down at once. I must stay at your house today." So Zacchaeus came down at once, happy to welcome Jesus. Everyone who saw this grumbled, saying, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I gave half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I repay them 4 times as much." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this household, because he too is a son of Abraham. The human one came to seek and save the lost."
Well, for the past several weeks now, we've been reflecting upon our lives living on the edge. Since September 4th, wow, that seems such a long time ago, doesn't it? But we've talked about living on the edge of possibilities, inclusion, indecision, privilege, belief, living on the edge of intentionality and despair, living on the edge of change and revelation. Taking all these edges into consideration, today we wind this worship series up with living on the edge of transformation. Or as I might say, the now what? Having recognized the things that can become speed bumps in our faith journey, indeed our life's journey, how do we move from the edge of all these things? How do we move from the edge of real transformation? I think our scripture story this morning gives us a clue, and I have to say it's one of my favorite stories. Perhaps it is because I can remember the song I just shared with Cedar. A song echoed in the halls of many Sunday school rooms, and you sang with me. So my guess is you learned it as well. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. I have to admit that once my friends and I thought we had long outgrown that version of the song, we made up our own. This is another thing my mom didn't know about till now. Sometimes it really is a disadvantage. She's a member of my church. But my friends and I, when we thought it was pretty elementary to sing Zacchaeus was a wee little man, we made up this version of it. Zacchaeus was a peen little man was he. Well, we got a little bit of trouble with our Sunday school teacher about that. But you know, I grew out of changing words to early Sunday school songs, and I grew into looking more deeply into the scripture stories. And for this particular story, it is rich. Now let's set it up a bit. For so often the real meaning that we might take from the Bible is hidden in the details. It's the details that it's easy to overlook or gloss over unless we're intentional. You see, it's no error that the writer of Luke puts this story after last week's story. And if you were here, you might recall that last week's gospel lesson also included a tax collector as a key character. But unlike our scripture lesson today, the tax collector last week was arrogant and selfish, prideful. But if you take time to sit down and read Luke's gospel in its entirety, you're going to find that tax collectors were not portrayed in the best of lights. And so we're set up for today's story. For as soon as we hear, a man was there named Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was rich. Well, when we hear that not only was he one of the bad guys, he was a leader of the scandalous tax collectors. He was chief tax collector. And not to miss, he was collecting in Jericho, which would have been lots of money because it was a major economic center and very profitable for a tax collector. And also not to miss, you remember another story that takes place in Jericho. When Jesus was passing through the city, Joshua won in the battle of Jericho. And now Jesus was passing through as he journeyed to Jerusalem to face his death. We might wonder then, with Jesus aware of his very short time left on earth, might he be using this example of Zacchaeus to continue hammering home his ministry and message of radical inclusion? Well, for whatever reason, the story unfolds, and really there are many angles from which to reflect. This morning, I'd invite you to join me in a closer look at the short man's trick to encountering Jesus. Fast forwarding to the end of the story, we absolutely witness complete transformation, don't we? For without being coerced or egged on to do so, Zacchaeus demonstrated his conversion. Listen again to the words that Cindy read about this greedy, rich, and despised tax collector. We're at the end of the story, and he says, having seen Jesus, "Look, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay it back 4 times as much." Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. Zacchaeus took that literally. But oh, my friends, this is so much more than about money. For the intent is to demonstrate with the story that Zacchaeus had changed his attitude about his fellow human beings. No longer did he view those folks in Jericho as numbers. No longer did he see them as tax debtors who could feel his financial gains. No longer did he put himself on a pedestal above them. And no longer was he in cahoots with the political powers. For you see, what we need to notice here, my friends, is that once Zacchaeus had an encounter with God, his life was transformed. For now, he looked around and saw brothers and sisters, not potential tax folks that he could go steal their money from. Now he stood before them with a humble heart and a willing spirit, and it changed the direction of his life. From profit and greed and status and pretension, it changed his life from all that to service and kindness and ministry. Indeed, it's a beautiful story. But if you will, let's look just a little bit further, because I think it's really important to notice that the transformation of Zacchaeus does not happen, my friends, it cannot happen without intentional acts by Zacchaeus himself. He had obviously heard about this rabbi Jesus, and he was interested enough to join the crowd seeking to get a glimpse of Jesus as he passed through that day. But the problem was, Zacchaeus was short. Now that could mean literally that he was a short man in terms of his height. But it might also be a metaphor. For we see lots of those in the Bible. It might also be a metaphor to indicate that for whatever reason, even though Zacchaeus was intentional on going to the parade, there were obstacles in his life that would keep him from seeing the face of God. I love to think about that possibility? Might you? Not that there's anything wrong with a short man making a simple correction to his viewing area by climbing the closest tree. That in and of itself would point to Zacchaeus doing something intentional and taking action. Yet if we go a bit further in examining this possibility of obstacles, it seems to me that we might paint ourselves squarely in the middle of this picture. Is it ever hard for you to see God in your life, in your family, in your relationships, in the wider world? Do you ever experience distance from God? You know, I speak to a lot of folks as pastor, and they'll share with me their despair or their fear or their anger, confusion, their doubt. And I talk a lot about the abiding presence of God. And yet I also know that while cognitively I know that God, our Creator, is always with me, is always with you, no matter what's going on, there have been and are times when I feel as if God might be tending to other pressing matters, except for mine. And I don't sense that close connection. This scripture is a reminder that God never moves from me. I sometimes move from God. I allow obstacles to obstruct my view. Has that ever happened to you? I also listen to folks who tell me that they just don't sense God's presence, and then when I ask them about their prayer life, or how much time they spend reading Scripture, or how many hours they volunteer to stand up for injustice or discrimination or make a positive difference in the world, well, I see glazed looks and sometimes glaring eyes. How dare you, Pastor, question my spiritual disciplines or the way I spend my time? You don't walk in my shoes. You don't know my challenges. You don't understand. And all that might be true. But I'm going to tell you, here's what I do understand. We cannot experience God until and unless we are willing to do our part to overcome the obstacles standing in the way of our relationship to God. I'm going to say that again. We cannot experience God fully, my friends, until and unless we are willing to do our part to overcome the obstacles standing in the way of our relationship with God. A transformative relationship with God requires us to do our part. It's not a passive relationship. You know, perhaps the early believers in this ancient community took the gospel to heart, and they fervently prayed for this guy, Zacchaeus. He would steal from them, and they'd hear that commandment, pray for your enemies. And yet this story demonstrates that all the prayers of the world would not have changed Zacchaeus until he took action. He had to choose to do more than just show up. He had to climb a tree. He had to put his pride aside and demonstrate a willingness to do something different than the taller folks in the crowd. And once he found a sycamore tree whose low branches made it a good climbing tree, we can almost hear his proclamation, can't we? Ah, there he is. Now I can see him. Stay with me here just a bit longer. Because Zacchaeus didn't just climb the first tree in sight. No, listen, the scripture said, he ran ahead. He ran ahead. In other words, Zacchaeus was eager, and he didn't want to take the chance that by the time he climbed the tree, Jesus would be long past. He wanted to give himself the best chance for a divine encounter. And so he set himself up to be transformed, and he heard Jesus say, today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. And you heard as Cindy read the scripture, the folks who witnessed that were not too happy. They grumbled about Jesus accepting such a sinner man. But Jesus said, Zacchaeus, you too belong in God's circle. You too can be saved from your greed and self-indulgence. You too can be restored to this community that you have stolen from. You, wee little man, you too. This transformation was possible because Zacchaeus wasn't concerned anymore about his appearance or his status or pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't intent on justifying his profession. Here he was, running ahead, climbing a tree, yearning for one thing, to see God. To have a divine encounter that would change who he was and what he was about. I wonder this morning if we might share that kind of yearning. A desire that moves far beyond Sunday morning. A relationship not based on checking the perceived church boxes, but rather a yearning for an authentic relationship with God. I wonder, church, if we might be so bold as to confront our obstacles. Obstacles that are standing in the way of our relationships with one another or our relationships with God. Obstacles which clearly cloud our vision or distract from our view. Might we look this morning for a metaphoric tree to climb? Might we reprioritize our time? Might we forgive those whose hurt is keeping us from a clear connection to God because we're fixated on our pain instead of the same grace that God gives to us? Might we this morning do a reset and run to God's purpose for our life? You see, it really wasn't a short man's trick that resulted in Zacchaeus' transformation. It was intentional and difficult steps to open himself to something bigger than him. And once Jesus saw this willingness, he said to Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. I'm going to your house today. Can you imagine how that must have felt? God claiming Zacchaeus. My brothers and sisters, God claims us too. God calls us by name. And when we do our part to meet God in spite of our fears, in spite of our failures and our doubts, in spite of our anger and frustrations and disappointments, when God sees us doing our part to stay in relationship, we might just hear too, hey, you in the tree, come down here. I want to live with you. I want to walk with you. I want to live through you. I want to transform you. Come here.